Welcome to this episode of the For Everyday Leaders podcast. Brandon Faust, Alex Holt here with you today. Alex, tell us what this podcast is all about.
Yeah, this podcast is all about helping people lead in the everyday spaces and moments of life. And today on the episode, we have got Lucas Pulley with us. Lucas is the executive director of Underground Network, an experimental community made up of over 100 microchurches in Tampa Bay, and now serving dozens of similar decentralized and empowering movements around the world. Lucas has over a decade of experience planting microchurches and leading decentralized networks of grassroots churches. He is driven to see cities transformed by the priesthood of all believers, activated in the mission of God. He is a loving husband and a father to 3 great kids.
Super excited for you all to hear this conversation with Lucas. Lucas has inspired actually a lot of the work that we're doing as well. But before we get to our interview with Lucas, this episode of the For Everyday Leaders podcast is sponsored by the Liston Lodge. Liston Lodge is an event venue located in Hendricks County, just 35 minutes outside of downtown Indianapolis. The estate was a former 22,000 square foot gorgeous private residence and now is a unique venue that features elaborate woodwork, unique chandeliers, a cozy and homey atmosphere, and beautiful secluded grounds, actually 100 acres of secluded grounds. Whether it's for a special event, a corporate event, or a wedding, I want you to visit listonlodge.com. That's listonlodge.com. Lucas, thank you so much for joining us on the For Everyday Leaders podcast. It's been awesome over the years to kind of follow what the Underground Network is doing. You've been a key part in all of that. And, you know, I kind of got connected to everything that the Underground was doing. Probably like 2015, 2016, I had heard some rumblings after I spent some very disorienting time going over to India and studying under a church planting movement there. And some people said, hey, maybe some of the closest thing that's happening that we've seen is what's going on in Tampa with the Underground. And so it really piqued my interest. But then when the Underground Church book came out, a lot of the resources that I started to see online, I was like, man, this is awesome. Somehow ended up friending you on Facebook. And a mutual friend of ours is actually doing some ministry in Canada now, affiliated with what you all are doing. And so, Lucas, it's just so good to have you on here, man. Could you tell us just a little bit about where you grew up and what was life like for little Lucas going up through the years, and kind of how you ended up getting on this path, man?
Yeah, I actually grew up in the Midwest, closer to where you guys are at, actually. Yeah. I was born and raised until I was 18 in Champaign-Urbana.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Yeah, so actually I always say Champaign-Urbana because I was a farm kid. I grew up in a tiny rural town that nobody's heard of, so I always have to say Champaign, but it's a little town called Gibson City. And I literally grew up on a farm without neighbors within like a mile radius until I was 10. And then I moved into what felt like a big city to me, but it was actually 3,600 people and a McDonald's, you know?
Yeah. Hey, I just have to say, Gibson City, I drive through there regularly to see my in-laws.
That's right.
So
yes.
I know all about Gibson City.
It is a pass-through, man. It's a pass-through in that area. So, and my whole side of the family now has kind of migrated up to Chicago area. So we have a lot of links in Chicago. And but when I turned 18, I went down to Southern Illinois University down in Carbondale, Illinois. And I surrendered my life to Jesus like a month before I went to college. Wow. My life kind of train wrecked the summer before I went to college. And it's a spiral of things: drugs, alcohol, an addiction to theft, and a real double life kind of situation. And it all kind of came out like right in that summer, and my life was in a kind of total shambles. And through a few friends and a couple college ministry type things that kind of allowed me access to just like study the scriptures, learn about Jesus. I surrendered my life to Jesus in a ditch on a country road the month before I went to college. So wow. I went to college like a baby believer, and I tried to do the like I can be a Christian but not be a part of a church because churches are a weird thing for a little while, and then kind of ran into like that doesn't work. So I joined a campus ministry, and in my head it was like, yeah, this is my church, because I was just so young or whatever. And so I joined a campus ministry and had a guy like in his 40s that had been like the staff worker of that campus ministry for 20 years just sit down and like disciple me for like again, I was just like barely a believer and just had this like really rich investment from this older believer. And I mean, within like 6-9 months, he was encouraging me to like go and try to plant a little Discovery Bible study in my dorm. So I went knocking on doors on a 17-floor tower of my dorm and tried to get a little Bible study off the ground, and had a handful of guys like meeting in a lounge and looking at the book of John. I barely knew what I was doing, but just like seeing God at work in people's lives, clearly despite my like qualifications or my giftedness. And the next year I was kind of overseeing the small group planting in every dorm on campus. So I was sort of in like a leader of leaders thing. Again, really, it felt very accelerated. And so at the same time, we were studying Acts as a campus ministry. And I was also going to Sunday morning churches and just feeling that dissonance. Again, I was only a believer for like a year.
Yeah.
And we were like planting these Bible studies on campus, like taking huge risks, sharing our faith, trained as missionaries, like laying down our lives, being really sacrificial, and then going to the Sunday morning thing and really just being asked to like sit and give money and kind of watch something. And it just felt like, again, because I didn't have a lot of the baggage, or baggage isn't the right word, a lot of like the pre-existing experience or tradition. Yeah. The dissonance was so sharp for me. I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I cannot put the dots together here. So it was probably like our senior year of college, where this team of college students, we just felt the Lord leading us to not just do ministry on campus, but ministry in the city. So we just started a bunch of like ministry among the poor, and we started doing house church stuff, and it kind of spiraled into this grassroots network of decentralized, like, we didn't have the language of microchurch we didn't have any of that. There was no paid staff. We weren't called anything. It was a total mess. But to us, it just felt like we're just trying to listen to Jesus and obey and be the church and like reach the city and play our part in like redemption in this place. And, it was after college, a lot of that student leadership team decided to stay in that town and keep doing that together because it was being so fruitful. So we just found whatever jobs we could and we just stayed. And that little community that wasn't called anything and didn't have any staff, this was way back in 2010, that ended up becoming a sister movement in the underground. And because I was making a ton of what I felt like were preventable mistakes. And so we hit a season in 2011, 2012, where we felt like we just need leadership. We need mentor. We need people who are going to help us walk this road. Yeah. And that's how we got connected to Tampa Underground. And Tampa had started in 2007. So they were about 3 or 4 years down the road. So I came and lived at Tampa for like a month and just went into learn mode and just lived in a few microchurches and like helped out at the what's called the hub. And then some of the leadership from Tampa came up and lived with our community for a couple of weeks and just saw what we had going on. And after like a little bit of we just kept learning from each other, mutuality, visit with each other. They were just like, look, this is like, you're an underground movement. If that's what you want, like, you're free to just kind of like officially be what we call a sister movement now. Yeah. So and at that time, we don't do it this way anymore, but at the time I basically went on staff with Tampa Underground, but located in Illinois. Yeah. As a way to just make that work in terms of like infrastructure and back office and all that kind of stuff. And, and then, we just were part of that community in Southern Illinois, college town, until 2016. And that's when the leader of Tampa Underground was experiencing like a shift in his own leadership and journey. And the community of elders and board members were discerning what's next for Tampa Underground. And they asked my wife and I to consider coming down. So we've been here. We led the Tampa movement. We moved here in 2016. We led the Tampa movement for 4 or 5 years as the directors of the Tampa movement. And now I'm also the executive director of the Underground Network, but still kind of co-directing the Tampa movement here. Yeah. So,
Lucas, there's so much right there. Like even just hearing you talk about that, and then kind of what you guys are all up to now, It's beautiful. And I think there's so much, for me, having worked in some pretty large churches, I would say right around that 2015 period in my life, it was kind of like, hey, you should just go and try and be a lead pastor at one of these big churches. Like that was kind of like spoken into my life. And okay, I think that's, I'd been working at a church since I was 18. It was like, that's all I knew. I think that's what I'm supposed to want. I like preaching and teaching, but like this leadership side and equipping and training, just put a stone in my shoe, man, and that I could not shake out. And I think so much of that, now this tidal wave, I think of the last few years, especially of things that have happened in church leadership, in church leadership, public failings and fallings and all those kinds of things, as well as just the reality of COVID and the implications of that on the church and society and all that stuff. And attending a worship gathering, right? And it was like, you just saw the scramble of like, hey, maybe you could get people to watch this on a TV, but it was like, okay, what if we just flip the system a little bit? And I think that's what you guys have done. Talk about how that's different and why that's a fundamental shift that, microchurch is not just like, is it outreach ministry that people might think? Yes. Is it discipleship? Yes, it's all discipleship. Is there gatherings? Yes. Is there eventually some leadership structures and accountability? Yes. So talk to us about why that's just different, and I think even just hearing you say like you experienced this like holistic type ministry where people are being equipped and released in college. And then you're like, well, this is different when you come to a service, at a local church on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we would say that, we have an ecclesial minimum. That basically just what that means. Ecclesiology, the study of the church, the science of the church. The minimum is just like, what is the minimum definition or the minimum, from a crass business term, the minimum viable product that makes a church a church? What has to be in place for a church to be a church? And we kind of decided to formulate in the underground community like a defined ecclesial minimum. That's less, it's not necessarily a pragmatic belief. It's a theological belief. It's like looking at the scriptures in the New Testament and trying to discern how did Jesus and how did those early apostles and disciples view the church? How did they understand the church? And so our ecclesial minimum is worship, community, and mission. And what we mean by that, worship, not banging on a guitar worship, but like Romans 12, living sacrifice, lay down our lives for the reign of Jesus in submission to Jesus. By community, we don't mean see each other once a week over breakfast and Bible study and then never interact again. It's like interdependent spiritual family, like life on life. And by mission, we mean to proclaim and demonstrate the kingdom of God among the lost and the poor. So basically what we've tried to form a community where when we say the word church or we say the phrase church planting, what people imagine is something that they themselves can do. So the church can actually be in a living room, on a street corner, wherever a community of people have gathered around the leadership of Jesus to pursue some piece of the mission of God in the city. That's a church. And previously when people would hear the word church or church planting, what's the imagination for like modern church planting? It's stages, it's $300,000, it's fog machines, it's a really good communicator, it's a built out infrastructure and programs. And again, not all that's bad, but it's not required to be the church, and it's muddied people's understanding of being the church and being church planters where they live, work, and play. So we've tried to kind of narrow that definition down for people. And part of that is so that we can kind of get closer to that kind of historic and even kind of underground China church slogan, which is every disciple a church planter and every church a church planting church, right? So if you actually want to do that, you've got to make that replicable, viral, accessible to any disciple of Jesus. And so, what we see as church and what we're multiplying around the city is a lot more simple. It's a very ordinary, but at the same time, we would make the argument that some of these things are actually more potent and powerful than other things around the city that have the word church slapped on them, because there are other infrastructures, not all, but there are other buildings or infrastructures or entities that have church in their name, but they don't necessarily have worship, community, and mission. They have one or two or something like that, and it's And we would say that if you're missing one of those, you're actually a less potent and less powerful force of what God intends in the world. And so these things are if you were to stop by one of our microchurches, they're like very ordinary, very simple. And yet they are seeing people come to Jesus. They're baptizing in their backyards. They're like, the other piece of, so one, microchurches are like calling based. We're basically just encouraging the priesthood of all believers to listen to Jesus for their Ephesians 2:10 calling in this season. Mm-hmm. Who has he asked you to reach? What has he asked you to do? And as soon as you have clarity about that, you can actually go and plant the gospel and see if a church might emerge. Plant yourself as a missionary and see if you can find people of peace. So it's calling driven. So everybody's really just like listening to the Lord for their calling. And then we have a really high value for contextualization. So whenever people are asking us, what's the rhythms of a microchurch? What do your microchurches look like? What content do they study? What's the life cycles of a microchurch? There's 100 different answers to those questions because we're letting these microchurch leaders make decisions about the best way to reach the pocket of people that they're called to reach, the best way to design, the best way to organize, which is going to be different depending on who they're reaching. So the philosophical difference there is that the called missionary is the one who is responsible to make disciples and the one who is best equipped to do so. Yeah. So it would actually be arrogant and sometimes inappropriate for me from like some kind of high hierarchical seat to decide for somebody who's reaching a pocket of people that I don't know anything about and a calling that I don't have to tell that person how to do it. Because that person actually contains in them the wisdom and the equipping and the indigenous evidence to be able to make decisions that I would never actually think to make. And we have hundreds of examples of how that looks.
Well, I think, there was a pastor that I worked with, and he said, do I actually believe that person sitting in our congregation is just as called and equipped as I am to do ministry? And that was something he always put. I love that he put that in front of us, and that led to, like, there was I don't know how to say this other than like there was a wrestling like WWE style show that we would have in our church building, and this guy led what we called an outpost, kind of like this micro church of people who loved wrestling, right?
Like, I love it.
And like, and it wasn't just like Christian wrestlers coming in. It was, these amateur guys. So it was adding value to them. That was his access point for the gospel. This was his people, right? These were his friends. And then he was bringing them together, adding value to them. And then he'd have some things like someone might share the gospel at like an intermission, but like the relationships that happened there. And then people who formed around it because they said, well, I like to help put on events, or I could help you do this. It was a family friendly experience. And like, there's been people who, that's their community, right? So it was like really cool, beautiful, and seeing like as simple, your access point might be Little League baseball. Right. Your access point might actually be, if you could spend a little bit more time prayer walking your neighborhood and seeing these neighbors and doing, barbecue or barbecue and bourbon or whatever it might be is your thing, and connecting dudes together or connecting with women or serving a certain group of kids or whatever it might be. And I think that permission giving operating system to say it's built this way is what has been so, I think people are hungry and longing so deeply to participate in the mission of God. And I love what you said. All those other things that might be happening, what we might see as like the traditional type of local church aren't wrong, aren't bad, but are they short? Are they missing maybe this operating system that helps send, the sending mechanism, and not just in a macro church plant vibe, but like in these smaller expressions and all those things.
Yeah, Lucas, totally. I want to like talk about that idea a little bit more of this like permission giving leadership, because I think a lot of leaders would sit whatever organization they're in, whatever church they're in, and be like, man, that just feels like foreign to me. I don't know if I've ever done that. Like, I don't know how to do that.
It feels like, I can see where some people are like, that's wild and reckless. Like,
Yeah.
when I was in India and this guy's like, I have started 12, like, I've discipled down to the 12th generation. And I was like, wow, that must have taken like a lifetime or whatever, right? And he's like, no, that guy's been a believer for 6 months. And I'm like, my brain just broke.
Right.
Like, how do you compute? Like, did they go through membership? Like, do they know all the creeds?
Yeah, right.
So I think talk about that. Like, how have you guys developed that part of your community? Because I'm sure you've had people that you've said, hey, you've got permission to go like be a missionary in your community. And I'm sure they've looked at you like, what you want me to do? You're giving me permission to make a decision. Yeah. Talk about how you guys have like built that community and relationship with people to allow them to go do that.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we have a culture now that helps us. So today, if people are around there's just in the air we breathe, in the environment of the underground for like 4 or 5 weeks, they're immediately, without anybody asking them, they're immediately wondering, what am I called to? And I either need to join a microchurch or I need to start one. And it seems like everybody around here has some kind of sense of clarity around their calling, and they really believe that God can like equip them to go and do and be missionaries. So that's a culture now that's sort of established, and it helps us. You know, there's a lot of church environments where culture is your worst enemy, but in our situation, it's sort of our best friend. But the cultivation of that culture is a great question. Like, so I think in the earliest days of the underground, now we have a service platform that's built out to help serve and come alongside microchurches. And that service platform is like financial services and media services and training resources and a co-working hub. We basically just build out all these resources so that when we approach people who have a calling or they approach us, we can basically just say, what are the barriers between you having an idea and doing that thing? And we can remove all of them.
I love that.
But in the earliest days, there was no media resources. There was no financial resources. There was no co-working space. And honestly, that's not what people needed.
Right.
What people needed was people in their overseers in their life, people with just a drip of spiritual authority to sit down with them across a table over coffee or pizza or something like that, and ask them questions about their calling, their missional dream, their sense of destiny, their like if your gifts could intersect with the world's need, just asking some of those questions. Yeah. And whenever they have any sense of like clarity about that, for a person of spiritual authority to look them in the eyes and say, not only can you do it, you should and you must. Yeah. You must do it. Those people don't need logos. They don't need payroll processing. They don't need, they don't need a business card or a website or something like that. They need permission. Yes. And the permission has to come from somebody just with an ounce of spiritual authority that can sit across from the table and activate them. And not only activate them verbally, but say, if you need me to come with you, I will. Because there's some apostolic leaders who the moment that they even perceive permission, they're going to go do it and you're not even going to know they're doing it. Yes. Like you'll find out 6 months later that they did it.
Yes.
But people who don't have a strong apostolic drive and they lean a little bit more pastoral or evangelistic or prophet, sometimes they need an apostolic leader to say, I'll come with you. I'll actually help you start that thing in the earliest phases. I'm not going to stay with you forever, but I'll help you get it off the ground because they need the support and accountability and the phase planning. In the earliest days, it's nowadays it's one of our little soapboxes that we sit on with communities around the world that are trying to talk with us and do something similar. There's a lot of people that look at essentially our incubator, our platform of services. Yeah. And that looks so shiny and attractive. They try to build that first. Right. They try to think without having any microchurches started. They're already thinking about how do I get a media services and financial services departments. Don't waste your time on any of that until you have 20 microchurches. From the moment you start, you're just trying to find people who have like some sense of calling, some sense of desire, some sense of dream or destiny for the kingdom in your city. And you give them all your time and attention, releasing them and giving them permission and coming alongside them to whatever extent they need to get stuff off the ground.
So good.
That's so good.
You know, Lucas, we have this discovery platform we call Life Mapping You, and we found that like 25% of people in the last 2 years were ready to start something. And they may have been Christians or may not have, but like to launch a nonprofit, something for good in our community. And so we were like, gosh, we need to pay attention to this because we helped them discover this. And it's kind of like this active reflective process. And there's a workbook, an online course and all the things, right? And then we're like, we just need, a lot of these people, they didn't need all the bells and whistles and stuff, which we're building some of those things out in this Impact Studio initiative, but they just needed some people to be around them, right? Because you were right. They would just boom, shoot off and go start. And sometimes it's just a grassroots thing. It's like just a local community minute. And then sometimes it's like, oh, we're 501c3 formation and this is now you're going to go work for this entity and all that kind of stuff. But I think just that, that person who can say it out loud and people don't say, oh, well, that's a dumb idea. People who just say, man, like, how can we help? And you get a few catalyzing people in a room and you start, okay, naturally you start, brainstorm, feedback, encouragement, affirmation. Can I introduce you here, here, and here? Yeah. And I think that's something, regardless of like, if you're, quote unquote, working for some nonprofit or microchurch thing or local church, all of us can be doing that in the lives of people around us, where it's like, dude, yes, that's a great idea. How can I help you? Who can I introduce you to, man?
In the ever brilliant words of Ted Lasso, you can't bring an umbrella to the brainstorm. So good. There's a lot of people who really want to create a permission giving culture, but so while they're giving permission, they also don't have a bias toward yes. And so what happens is I want to release everything, but as soon as I'm interacting with a person that has an idea, my bias is actually toward no, and you have to convince me that the idea is going to work, or I have all kinds of feedback and critique on the idea. And I'm not kidding, man. In 10 years of doing this, every microchurch, like, we have this start something form. It's application is not the right word, but it's sort of an application to start a microchurch in the network or to join a pre-existing thing that you're doing to join the network. Every application that comes across the staff team's desk, and we kind of communally discern, is this a microchurch? How can we help? Like, what does this look like? Every microchurch that's come across our desk that we think this is a terrible idea. This is not going to work. It's embarrassing. It's weird. It's strange. But unfortunately, we are bound by policy to say yes to it because it satisfies the ecclesial minimum. Yeah. So it's clear in the application that it's worship, community, and mission, and it agrees with the Underground Manifesto and historic creeds. And like, we actually, per policy, have no reason to say no to this, except our own biases around what's weird or embarrassing or is not going to work. Right. And unfortunately, those don't qualify as reasons to say no. So we have to say yes. And every single one of those microchurches has like blown up with God's favor. And almost every single microchurch that comes across our desk, and I think, what a home run. This is going to knock it out of the park. This is amazing. It struggles. Yeah. And it's kind of been a learning experience for me that I actually have to protect the movement of God in our city from my own biases about what's going to work or not going to work.
Dude, that's good.
Because if so that's the permission giving thing. It's like, if I don't disconnect my permission giving drive from my own biases around what I think is going to work or not work, then it's not going to create that kind of free flowing, kind of chaotic, empowering culture. Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many examples. We just had a Dungeons and I just had a conversation a couple weeks ago with our Dungeons and Dragons microchurch, which again, that was one that I thought, what a terrible idea. This is not going to work. Yeah. And first of all, this is also a lesson in contextualization. If you asked me, I would have never even thought that Dungeons and Dragons communities were like a reachable people group, right? Like for the church to consider, right? Yeah. So that's the other thing. Like sometimes cities around the country are like, well, like, is the executive team of the Underground deciding what gaps there are in the city and then going and finding people and recruiting people? And that's not what's happening. What's happening is we're because again, that would filter in our biases around what the city needs. But we just sit back and wait for people to hear a calling from the Lord, and then we react and try to help serve them to get stuff out. So people are hearing callings all the time that would never meet my criteria if I'm looking at the city and thinking, what does the city need and what are the gaps and all that kind of stuff. So this guy is like, I feel called to these D&D communities. So already I'm like, that's weird. Is that really needed or necessary? But then what he does when he like incarnates among these communities is he decided, do you guys understand what D&D is? I barely do.
No.
Yeah, I've got some relatives who do that, and they've invited me, and I have always said no. And I have a next door neighbor. I said, you can invite me to a different game night. I'm not getting into your potions. I'm just not. I'm out on potions and stuff.
So I barely understand it, but I guess there's a person in the game who is like a narrator or like
the game master sort of or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Like they're basically in between sessions, they're kind of thinking about the storyline and what's next and what the decisions the characters are going to have to make or whatever. Well, this guy, he decides to volunteer to be the game master. And what he's doing is he's leading the campaign or the group of guys. Yeah. He's intentionally leading them into decisions as a team that are gospel-rich decisions. Wow. Where like a character has to decide, am I going to use my resources for myself, or am I going to use my resources in a way that's detrimental to me but helps the group? Yeah. Or even certain situations where people get really invested in their character, and he'll run them into situations where it's like, either your character survives or your character dies and the group moves on. Wow. So are you going to sacrifice your life for the group or not? Wow. And after the game, they'll debrief what that was like. And he has so many immediate interjections to be like, yeah, you know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the life of Jesus. Yeah. Like that's and they get to have all these, and he's seeing so much fruit. Now, listen, that's
incredible.
If I would tell him, like, first of all, I didn't think D&D communities were like a community to be reached in the first place. Second of all, if he feels called to go and we say yes, but we say, when you go, you have to use these tools and do it this way. He would never have thought to do it the way he's doing it. And we would have never thought to do it the way he's doing it. And it's brilliant. So I just think like the contextual, the shrinking down of my own, it takes a lot of humility, and it's literally the opposite of how the church has operated for 40 years.
Well, and I think in that too, like it's a reminder that you don't have to be miserable doing the mission of God. Right. Now, don't get me wrong, like we are to die to like all those kinds of things and serve others, but like we can, like God gave us things to enjoy. We might as well do that missionally. We might as well, as we're go and like do it with a smile on our face and add value to people and do things and bring them along in those things that we have access and actually have community and maybe knowledge or expertise or passion or any of those things. Like that's what a beautiful, beautiful reminder.
Absolutely.
What's Lucas, as in the kind of this cross section of leaders, what's kind of like a leadership principle that you've kind of over these last decade or so of kind of doing mission in this unique way? What's maybe something that has just resonated with you that we can kind of grab and put into our lives a little bit as you've learned so much these last 10 years and experienced things like Dungeons and Dragons to other kinds of, micro churches and the structure and all that kind of stuff, man?
I mean, I could say a few things. I mean, we after our community existed at about the 10-year mark, there was actually like a research company that was well funded that came down and did like a mass scale research project on our community of leaders. And they unearthed like a missionary journey that a lot of leaders went through. And it has several points of what you're saying, like these little nuggets that are pretty transcendent regardless of who you're reaching or how you're reaching them or what kind of person you are. These are generally true of a lot of people's journey. So maybe just a couple things from that. There's way too much to cover here, but just a couple things from that I think were helpful for us to kind of see. One was, again, we're obsessed with helping people discern their calling and then reacting to what that is and empowering them, coming alongside them. So how people discern their calling is a huge question for us. Like, what do you do with the people who don't yet have a calling, and how do you walk with them? Like, to what degree do we have any responsibility there, or can help people get there? Because that's really like a thing that God does. So we don't want to say like we can manufacture or pipeline that or something, but is there something that we can contribute there? And across the board, every leader that was kind of surveyed in this process, identified a season of what we call liminality that preceded their discovering of calling. And that what liminality is like a place of encountering pain, like either their own pain or the pain of the world. So, you know, a lot of people basically had an experience among the global poor. And you're talking about your trip to India, right? Yeah. Like a lot of people either went to a different context, went somewhere in the world, or even in our own inner city, like went to a place in our own inner city where they had to encounter things about the world that didn't seem right or fair or just. People were in pain, it didn't make sense, or even encountering a thing that God is doing really powerfully in another place, and then having to sit back and wonder, why isn't it happening? Like, why isn't it happening here? Yeah. And why are people stuck in lostness and like pain and in my context? And that season of liminality, either dealing with their own pain from the past or the pain of the world, almost preceding their discovery of calling, and realizing that it's sort of that pain where the Lord is kind of tilling the soil of your life to actually hear a word. It's kind of cracking open your desire to want to be used by God in some way. Yeah. But again, Westerners generally, I won't say like Americans, but Westerners generally have a very underdeveloped theology of suffering. And so we actually are obsessed with comfort and safety. And we, even people who have a little bit more of a pastoral bent, want to prevent people from experiencing pain or suffering or feeling unsafe. You know, we want to create everywhere a safe place, everybody's safe spaces. So it's like, but what that's doing, if we give into that, if we prevent people from experiencing pain or suffering or going through hard experiences, we're actually preventing them from having some kind of clarity or receiving that calling from the Lord. Yeah. So we actually have to embrace a better theology of suffering and actually help people walk through pain where God is present, you know, and help them debrief and discern that. So that was a big, important piece of learning for our community. It was something we were kind of doing intuitively, but we couldn't really name. And it was really, really important to name it and to be able to share that openly with people around the world. Another one is, trying to go about that fear of failure thing, which I'm sure you guys in kind of dealing with startup leaders and encouraging leaders, that fear of failure thing is really gnarly. And so, you know, we have this 4-phase system of microchurch development, and phase 2 is basically the experimental phase. And you kind of, it's a place where you have to be able to create new metrics that incentivize failure a little bit. Like you have to love failure. You have to turn it upside down. Yeah. And you have to like drip every drop of learning that there is in failure, and then go and be willing to fail again to drip every drop of learning out of it. Otherwise you don't learn anything. And so, you know, in our community, maybe this would be helpful. In our community, we've planted in the last 15 years, almost 600 microchurches. Yeah. Wow. And right now, and the average lifespan of a microchurch is about 2.5 years. Yeah. And right now, active, alive in the network is, again, around like 100 microchurches. Yep. So now, how many leaders have we that have like failed out of ministry and burned out? And not very few. Yeah. So those 400 to 500 microchurches that don't exist today, those are leaders that are pivoting. Yeah. They're realizing something's not working. Yeah. And they're totally changing the life rhythms or structure of a microchurch, or they're letting something dissolve because they've realized that God accomplished what he intended to accomplish with that expression of the church. And the most faithful thing that I can do with it now is to let it end. Yep. And the most unfaithful thing that I could do with that microchurch is try to keep it alive and give it a pulse for another 10 years when God has left the building. Yeah. I need to actually let it dissolve and discern what's next for me and this team of leaders around me. So actually like having a healthy theology of like church life cycles, that no church expression is supposed to live forever. There's going to come an end to every microchurch, and failure isn't something we're all failing. Yep. You actually have to like celebrate. Microchurches do weird things to like celebrate failure, like share your fail stories. And you kind of, if you're going to try to come at the fear of failure in a culture, Your culture has to incentivize faithfulness, not success. So
yes.
in the kingdom, there's no such thing as success or failure. There's only faithfulness. So let's incentivize and celebrate faithfulness. So when we share stories, if all your community ever does is share stories where things went super well, you're going to create a fear of failure.
Yeah.
Dude. Yeah. It's like takes that up and to the right metric that we've even unintentionally or sometimes intentionally put into churches, into all of our organizations, into our own lives.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, man, there's somebody I know that I would ask them, how are things going? They're like, up and to the right. And I'm just like, dude, there's no way. Like, and that's, and so if it's not up and to the right, then it's immediate failure. This thing is over. It's done, right? And so I love, like you said, that just kind of like over the years, the baking in of that culture. And I know that there are so many leaders who are trying to like bake that stuff in, just keep being faithful in it, right? Like that's it, just be faithful, period, right? And obviously, you know, some things there's finances or this and that metric, and those play a part of things, but the beauty of being like, hey, this thing ended and it had a great run. Let's celebrate that. And there's going to be a release of leaders or to go into this refreshment cycle. What a beautiful thing.
Yeah. We love that line from Luke when he sends the 72, where, you know, right before he sends them, he says, when you go, those who receive you, they receive me. But those who reject you, they reject me. And essentially what he's saying is like, when you succeed, don't celebrate it, because that was me. When you feel like you fail, don't feel bad about it, because they rejected me. So it's actually got nothing to do with you. You're the messenger.
Yeah.
And it's the Lord who bears the responsibility and the weight of like things going well or things not going well. Like you're in between. And then just that contrast of Isaiah was like one of the most faithful, most like locked in prophets of the Old Testament, and not a single person heard his message. Like not a single person responded and obeyed. He was the most faithful and least successful prophet in the Old Testament. And Jonah was the least faithful prophet in the Old Testament. Gave the worst sermon on record in the Bible. And yet an entire city and its livestock sat in sackcloth and ashes to repent. So we just have to relieve ourselves of that. Like,
that's good.
That's really
those
good.
success failure metrics,
That's
you know,
so good.
like.
Well, Lucas, I feel like we could keep talking for hours, but to help our listeners, we probably need to wrap this conversation up. As we wrap it up, we'd love to ask you, is there a book, a podcast, something that you've read lately that you listen to that you could share with our listeners just to encourage them, equip them, help them in their leadership journey?
Well, you know, I'm biased, so I like all the underground stuff, but I'm not going to be self-promoting. So something else that I've been reading lately that I think has been really important for us is anything. Maybe the best intro resource would be a book called Managing Leadership Anxiety by Steve Cuss.
Oh, yeah.
So good.
And he also has a complimentary podcast with it that's Managing Leadership Anxiety. But it's really like a great intro book on systems theory.
Yeah.
And anxious societal regression and anxiety, how anxiety works, how anxiety is caught by communities. It's kind of like a communal force that's a process underneath the content of our conversations. And so I think Steve Cuss does a great job of like providing some introductory frameworks into that conversation, but there's deeper resources like Ed Friedman's Failure of Nerve. Murray Bowen was one of the initial kind of thinkers around systems theory. But basically right now in the Christian world, in the year of our Lord 2022, like this country is the most anxious it's been since the 60s.
Yeah.
And missionaries and pastors and even outside the Christian world, educators, CEOs, managers, anybody in like a decision-making leader position has got to start understanding how anxiety works.
Yeah.
And how to manage it, not just in themselves, but in the teams and the communities that they find themselves in.
That's good.
And to try to figure out a way to be well differentiated leaders going forward. I just think that's really important content right now.
That's good.
Yeah, that's incredible. We'll be sure to link to Steve's book and podcast in the show notes for everyone.
Yeah, and Lucas, as we kind of end here, what are ways that people can connect with all that you guys are doing at the Underground? How can people connect with you? What are maybe like some resources, websites, those kind of things, man, that we can point people to?
Yeah. So TampaUnderground.com is a place where you can kind of learn more about the Tampa movement specifically, or undergroundnetwork.org is a place where you can learn about, our sister movements around the world and see where there are expressions of stuff like this all over the place, and engage some of our resources, coaching and consulting resources, to try to help folks start stuff like this. I barely have a pulse on social media, but I'd be happy to email with anybody that has questions or wants to talk more.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lucas. And we want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in to this episode of the For Everyday Leaders podcast. And we hope it helps you lead in the everyday spaces and moments in your life.
Yeah, and we'd love for you to continue to join us on the journey of the For Everyday Leaders podcast. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Anchor, and YouTube. Lucas, thanks for taking time. Thanks for spending time with us today. It was such a great conversation, and we really appreciate you.
Thanks, guys. Happy to be here.